All right, proper testing. What you test and how you can test it can make better software and faster tests. So the main point of me doing this talk is because both at work and here in the group and pretty much everywhere that I talk to developers, a lot of times the pushback against testing is that it's slow and that it's hard to do, and a lot of people don't even feel like they're doing it right or that it's even very useful, and they don't see a lot of benefit to it. And first, it does take a lot of practice to get good at it, which is why we do things like the cottage here, and I recommend that you do a lot of practice on your own. But also, it helps to actually know the proper way to test things. So we're going to talk about that today. First, we're going to start out talking about behavior driven development, which is what you should all be doing when you are developing your software by creating tests and then making code that fulfills those test needs. The idea is that you want to test what your software does, not how it does it. So you want to say, this is what I want, and then make some code that does that expected output. And there's different types of tests. There are acceptance tests. Again, this is focused mainly on a Rails app, so you can obviously test other things. But in a Rails app, there's acceptance tests. These tend to be slow, and there's no way around that for the most part. You're usually dealing with some kind of browser because you're mimicking what the user sees and does on there. There's also the fact that you're going to have to create a lot of context around a lot of your tests, so a lot of database hits, and that's just going to take time and effort. So you want to have as few tests as possible in the acceptance test area. You just want to be testing what the user sees, and when they do something, that it does what they thought it would do. There's also, in some applications, not all, there can be API or service level tests. So if your application has a nice divide between the UI and the application backend, like you're having a pure JavaScript, Angular, or Ember, or something on the front end that is talking to a JSON API, then you can test your API, and you can do that a lot faster than actually spinning up a browser to do a full acceptance level test. So those are still kind of expensive, so you don't want to have a ton of those. And then there's your unit tests, and those can be and should be extremely fast, and you want a lot of those. You want a lot and a lot, because that's where you're going to test out a lot of your edge cases. You don't want to be testing every edge case on the higher level tests, because it's going to take a lot longer. And object-oriented programming is not so much about the objects, but rather the messages that they send to each other. From now on, I'm going to start focusing mainly on just the unit tests, because that's where you're going to have most of your tests. And the other level tests should be easy, because there's not very many of them. And the simple rule is, say what you want to see, and make sure that you saw it. And that's, whether that's at the full browser level, at the acceptance level, or whether that's at the service level where you're just checking to make sure you got the right JSON, you're still just saying what you expect to see and doing it, basically letting the stack produce some output for you. So from the unit test down, we're going to talk about objects talking to each other and those interfaces. So basically, for any given object, it's got three kinds of messages that are going on. It's got incoming messages, messages coming into the object. It's got outgoing messages. This object may be collaborating with other objects and sending messages out. And then it's got its internal messages, like calling its private methods and things like that. And there are two kinds of messages in those three different types. There's informational or query messages, and there's modification or command messages. And it's important to know the difference between those. So a query message is one where you're basically asking an object for some information, and you shouldn't expect anything to change. You want to get some information back, and it doesn't matter how many times you ask that. Nothing should change about the system. It's just going to give you that answer, assuming nothing else in the system changed. A command message, though, may cause some kind of change. It's going to tell the object to either update some information about itself or change something about the state of the system. And ideally, you're not going to have them do the same, do both things at once. So This gets broken a lot, though, and you're going to break it. Rails breaks it. And so just by using Rails, you're going to break this. For example, if you give the command on your model to save, save returns true or false as to whether or not it's saved. And if it didn't save, then there's this magical errors thing that's created. And so that you can then query as well. And there's all this stuff happening when you say save, including an answer to whether or not it was successful. So these blend together, but ideally when you're building your software, you want to keep them as separate as possible. The reason is because this is what you're going to test right here. It's this simple. So my whole talk can be basically distilled down into this slide, but we're going to talk a little bit more about what this all means, okay? So for any given object that you're trying to test, you're going to test all incoming messages, whether they're the query or the command type messages. And you're going to test their outgoing command messages. And that's it. You're not going to test internally how it figures anything else out. You're not going to test to make sure that it can ask some other object an appropriate question. You just want to test the object and to make sure that if it tells some other object to do something, that it does tell it that. And so we're going to look at a little bit of examples here and go through that. Before I jump into the examples, though, I've decided to focus the examples a little bit on just, there's only a couple, because I want to leave some room for questions as well. Quite a lot of room for questions. So before I jump into the examples, I wanted to say that there's a bazillion wrong ways to test things. And so rather than trying to figure out a whole bunch of examples of what's wrong and talk through that, I decided to just focus on what the right way to do things is and show you that. And then we can talk in the question and answer period if you have specific questions about, well, I think I might want to be testing this. If that's not what I'm supposed to be doing, how do I do that thing? And we can kind of talk through that a little bit. Because a lot of folks are, even if they're doing these kind of tests, so maybe they're testing just in the green area, which would be great. A lot of times they're being inefficient as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how you can be more efficient in doing that, because a lot of times, especially in a Rails app, a lot of times in a Rails app, what you'll find is people excessively exercise their database. And so we're going to try and break you of that habit a little bit in talking through some of this stuff. So I decided, rather than pull a gazillion examples of the wrong way to do things, I decided to just create a few guidelines, and then we're going to talk through these. And some people may agree or disagree, but again, we're focusing on the unit tests. For your unit tests, don't use factories. I'm just going to put it out there right now. The reason is because for any given test, there should be a very specific setup involved, and so you're going to be overriding your factory definition for the most part anyway. Rule 2 is don't persist your models. So if you're not persisting your models, you're only using the build function of your factory anyway, and not the create function of your factory. So there's really no point to using factories, and if you do, you're going to slip into bad habits about sticking creates all over the place and creating objects when you don't actually need to create an object. And I say that to help you break some habits. If at some point after if you think you've gotten better at testing, if you want to add factories back into your unit test, then feel free, but I want you to confidently be using them in an appropriate manner. So the first thing is to stop using them until you know that you're using them right. And that you know exactly when you need to be persisting models. And because I put a star there because there are going to be unit tests where you do have to persist things. there's going to be some interaction between things that you need to have that persistence there, but there's not nearly as many as you think. Your models themselves should be a lot smaller than they are. In fact, the only thing I'd like to see in your models is, assuming they're active record models, is the relationship definitions, that has many, belongs to sort of things, the validations, so what's valid input, and some simple query methods possibly. And lost that again. Apple TV liked Judd tonight and not me.
Yeah, it seemed like it was working very early. I wonder if it's a time thing.
I timed it at 2 minutes.
It's got
No,
to be.
meaning like after a certain, like after 8 p.m. or after 7 p.m. it goes into.
I don't know. So anyway,
Yeah.
simple query methods. So again, your models can answer some basic questions about themselves where you're performing some kind of transformation that may be on some raw data that's useful in other areas. Predicate methods that you're adding in, or maybe some simple calculations or something like that. Anything else is probably going to need to live somewhere else because it's going to make it much easier to test. And if you follow some of these rules, you're going to be automatically architecting some better software because a lot of what I've noticed is people who have tests that are too slow or they're too complicated, they're often not actually following the behavior-driven development, which was way back at the beginning of my talk. They're writing some code and then making sure that there's some tests around that code and not truly doing it kata style like we do up here when we do the katas, where you actually say a test and say, this is what I want to happen, and then write some code to make it happen. The reason I say that is because a lot of times if you were to write the test of what you want to happen, you're going to quickly realize that there's no good way to write a test that's going to drive out code that's horrendously wrong. But and a lot of times you struggle with tests because you write some code and try and figure out how to test it, and it's very hard to figure out how to test it because you're trying to say, well, how can I get in here and test it appropriately unless I set up a whole bunch of setup and try and figure it out. So the best thing to do is to make sure you're writing those tests first, and it's going to show you when you're doing that it's probably not a great idea to be putting some of these methods in certain places. Like you might find that you are going to do a test that after a user signs up, they get a welcome email. And so you put an after save hook in, or after create hook in your model, and you say, okay, now I'm going to use a mailer to send out a welcome email, and then, okay, well now I got to test that. All right, well how do I test that? Okay, well I'll just create a user and then verify that my mailer queue got a mail in it. Now you automatically created a user just to test that, and you broke my rule of don't persist your models. So if you can figure out a way to test out sending that welcome email without doing that save, you're going to create a better system.
You have to wake up AirPlay again.
I know, that's what I'm working on. I figured I'd finish talking before I pulled it up again for no reason. So moving on from models a little bit, we're going to keep your models as dumb as possible. Your models are active record models. They are in charge of persisting your data. That's pretty much all they should be in charge of because that's a whole lot altogether. So I want you to use real objects for the object under test, but mocks for all collaborators. So if you have collaborating objects, the vast majority, if not the whole time, you should be using some mock objects. And you should inject those collaborators whenever possible. We'll talk about that a little bit. And any external services or APIs you use, wrap them with some kind of class that you own and can fully control. So rather than trying to mock out or stub out some external thing, wrap it in your own class and mock and stub that class. It's going to make your life a whole lot easier. You don't have to test that that external service works. Or you should be having confidence in the libraries that you chose to use that they actually do what they're supposed to be doing. You don't need to test that. All right. And that is frozen and did not mutate.
There you go.
Did it? All right. So here's an example class that, or test that I put together here just to show off a few examples of what I'm talking about, a proper way to test something. So I'm creating a new car, and I'm giving it a color, and I'm giving it a fuel tank. A fuel tank is a collaborating object that it's got. So this is an object that the car needs to work with in order to know how much fuel it has and do things with. I'm not giving it a real fuel tank. I'm giving it a double. I'm saying, here, I'm going to create this fake fuel tank that knows how to answer the fuel question and the burn question. And then I'm setting up a few different contexts. So the first thing I'm going to test is basically a query method on car. And I'm saying when the color's red, then I expect car to be popular. So car's got some method, popular question mark, and it's going to be true if the color's red. For the sake of having a small slide here, I only did one test around like each of these methods. But again, going to the idea that at the unit test level, you should have a lot of tests. You should be driving out the functionality of your code by building out a lot of tests around this. So I would have another context where the color's blue or black or whatever, and drive out what makes something popular or not popular, make sure that I've got that covered. Notice that the car doesn't have to be saved or persisted to anything just to know whether or not it's popular. The next thing I do is I say, if it's got a tank with 5 gallons of gas in it, then I want to expect the range on my car to be 100. And here I am, not that you should care here in the test, nor care too much from any point of view when you're looking externally at this object. The object is, all right, I guess I'm going to better plug into something because this is getting ridiculous.
I have a dongle that'll make your screen green.
Yeah.
I can warn you every 2 minutes.
Well, I don't even know how to make it not do it. Like, it's not me not touching it, I don't think.
You don't think having
You
just
probably
the
have
mouse
to make
move around?
the screen change.
Okay,
You
maybe.
probably have to go to the next slide and go back.
I think it was some setting that you said after 8 o'clock. Or 7 o'clock.
That was happening with my presentation.
Yeah.
Yep. That's what you need to test your
If there's test coverage for after 8 p.m.
Good job. It's not 8. It's more like
That's
7.
green. It's green. I'll go back there. I'll just touch things. And I'll work with it. You guys don't always need to see my screen. Just listen to my...
I'll give you this signal.
Whistle that.
How about the
I wonder if there's a setting that says after, like, thinking back,
It's got to be something.
because it was fine for me.
That would be insane.
All right. Here we go. Let's try this a little bit.
Short slides.
Yes.
Constantly keep hitting the forward.
I'll just keep hitting that shift here. So
Just they need Dodgers
So we're talking about the range method. So the range method is collaborating with the fuel tank in order to get its answer. But notice we're just testing that we got the right answer that we want. We're not testing that we did anything with the fuel tank at all. And that's basically, you'll see this a lot in your code. Go home and look for it. You'll find that you might be testing that something got some call and that you maybe even got the right answer that you were expecting. You don't need to test that. You shouldn't be testing that because that object already has tests around that query method. You don't need to make sure that that query method knows how to answer the question. And so you don't need to make sure, you don't even need to make sure that it used that object to figure out your answer here. Because again, this is a query method on car. You just want to make sure that car knows how to answer the range method. Maybe someday down the road, you decide to figure it out without the fuel tank for some reason. That's okay. The test will still pass because all you're checking for is that it actually gives the right answer. Now, down here though, when we drive 20 miles, now we start commanding the car to do some things, okay? So we expect it to increase the odometer on the car by 20. So we have an expectation here that when we drive 20, it's going to change the odometer by 20. And we also have an expectation that our fuel tank should receive the burn message with 1. So we are basically telling the fuel tank we got to make sure that it's told to burn 1, because in order for our system to be correct, we need to make sure that that fuel tank got the right command there, because it's changing the state of our system. Okay, so car has a type coupling there to fuel tank, and you need to make sure that that's there, and that's making sense there. So when we drive 20, it should receive that message with that value. So if all of your testing follows this pattern, and again, this is only one example for each one, your test will be very fast. There's no saving anything here. You're checking that all the messaging that's appropriate is happening and that you're getting the right answer for all those messages. And you should be pretty confident in your software with this. And you'll notice that if you use any kind of coverage tools, you're going to get the same, if not higher, coverage levels that you were previously with excessive testing things that you shouldn't necessarily be testing. And just in case anyone's curious, I just put together a quick little car class here that it's not active record, but it could be that basically meets those tests. Just to show that the range method currently is using fuel tank. But again, we're not testing that we're using fuel tank in that range method. So now we're going to look at something a little scary. So, oh no, I went to our topics app. Here we go. And there's this.
Where's the sound? Dun, dun, dun.
There's this innocuous little method here on meeting that says can give kudo and give it a user. The whole idea is for a given meeting, a user can give a kudo if none of the topics, there's 3 on a typical meeting, but if none of the topics has had a kudo given to it by the user, then they can give a kudo on the meeting, okay? And that's a check that we use to know whether or not we should even display the buttons for you to vote. And so the idea is if you can, if you haven't given a vote yet, then you can give one. And so it's pretty basic logic here. But I'm going to show you the current test as it lives in the system. So this is a chunk of described meeting. And what we have here is from the subject down to this end, we have all the setup for this test. We are creating a meeting, we're creating a user, then we're creating 3 more users, then we're creating 3 topics, and then we're going over the time slots that were generated on the meeting when we set it up, and we're setting the proper presenter, and then we're saving the meeting, and then we're looping over the time slots again, and we're updating the topics with our meeting ID, and then which is an update attribute on each and every topic, and then we're reloading the meeting. And then in our test, specific test, we say that when the user is given a kudo, before we do this test, we're going to grab the first topic and we're going to give a kudo as that user, which also does a save in the database of that kudo. And then we reload the meeting again out of the database to make sure we have the most freshest meeting possible. And then we expect that the can give kudo for that user to be false. So after all of that, we're just checking, and this is the only case we have around can give kudo, by the way. We don't have any edge case testing. This is the only test. Unfortunately,
just so everyone knows, doing this test took us an hour and a half. And that's an hour and a half of me, Alex, and Jason arguing about what setup we needed to do this.
We're missing reload. We're missing.
Yeah.
Why isn't it working?
We're missing another reload.
Put a reload in there.
So here's the scary part now. I talked about all that database hitting that we were doing in there. The super scary part, and I didn't put it in the slides because it wouldn't fit, but if you go to our GitHub account, you can look at the Soapbox app, pull up the meeting spec, and you'll see that actually this can give kudo doesn't look exactly like this because we used this whole setup from here to here so many times. We created a shared context for that. And so we have a whole bunch of tests in this meeting spec that each one says, by the way, give me a full meeting setup. And so for each one of those tests, it does all of that. And then we do some little thing to test something. All right. So this is a pretty extreme case, but unfortunately I've seen stuff that's not horribly different from this in code in other applications that real developers on real applications have written. And a lot of times, again, you'll get a test like this a lot of times after the fact, where code exists and you say, hey, I need to figure out how to make sure that that does what I think it does. And so then you end up doing all this setup to make sure that it does what you think it does. And if you had actually written the test first, you probably wouldn't have gone through all that setup. So what I did, though, is I said, well, even knowing all that, we can still test this in a way that doesn't have a single database hit to make sure that we can actually verify that the logic in this method is correct. Again, all we care about is this method on meeting. We want to verify that meeting can answer this question. Now, that's actually a fairly easy thing to test because for the most part, meeting is just delegating the answer somewhat down to topic. And it's doing a little bit of logic, though. We're making sure that every single topic answers the question in a negative fashion. So we want to make sure that every single topic says, this user is not giving me a kudo. So here's my tests. I actually did 2 tests around it just to show that it's a little bit better to have some different cases, but I would make even more because I did the simplest possible 2 test cases. The idea here is we have a meeting still. This time we're just doing meeting.new, and we're just getting a new meeting. And instead of creating a user, we're just doing a double user because we never even touch the user. We never ask it any questions. We never do anything with it. We just need one. We need one to ask about. And we have a topic that has a kudo that's been given, and we have a topic without a kudo. And for each one of those, we're just creating doubles. And we're saying, for this one, I want you to answer the question given kudo true, and for the other one, given kudo false. Okay? Now, the real topic, in order to answer that question, would have to have a lot of setup, like we saw in the previous slide. But again, topic should have tests around given kudo. It's a public interface on topic, and as long as you've tested given kudo for a user on topic appropriately, then you can confidently know that when I'm testing it on meeting here, that I can freely use given kudo and stub it out here just like this on this double and test exactly what I want to test. And that is my logic that's in my method on meeting correct? And so the only thing that I have to kind of cheat here that I don't love, but this is active record, and so this is how you have to do it, because meeting has a set of topics, and typically when you ask meeting for its topics, then active record magically does some database queries and says, here's your active relation that you can then treat like an array and do some things with. And we don't want that. We want to use our topics. So I'm basically stubbing out topics on meeting and returning the topics that I care about and want. And
I was going to bark at David, but he was saying that.
I know. It's just horrible tonight.
It's 2 minutes. So
all right, it is. I guess I don't know. All right. So anyway, kudo with a user is false. And then we're going to do the opposite on the other one. We're going to use an array with a topic without a kudo, and we're going to make sure that it's true. And again, these are the simplest cases. I would also do some other cases with some larger arrays where maybe I have a mix of some with, some without, but I just wanted to show this as the starter case for doing these tests. And with these tests, assuming a few more on the edge case there, we can be pretty confident that our meeting knows how to answer this question correctly with the logic we have in place. And again, this is all predicated on the idea that you have appropriate tests on topic. And so while you're doing your behavior-driven development and driving out tests, you may start from the outside in and you may get to meeting first, and you may have to realize that in order to answer this question, I need to ask my topics about something. That's cool. You just switch over and start writing some tests for topic and make sure that topic actually knows how to answer the question correctly. And then you can come back and confidently know that topic knows how to answer it right, and just test meeting to make sure we're doing it on meeting correctly. And that's really the core of how to break this down and where the boundaries are. And I'm going to go back, the last slide just says questions, so I will let you ask some questions. But I'm just going to go back here because this is the most important thing. You're only testing 3 things. And as long as you're only testing those 3 things, your tests are going to be fast, and you're going to be testing exactly the right amount of stuff. You're not going to be testing too much, you're not going to be testing too little. And you can be confident that you have strong test coverage and that your software does what you expect it to do. Questions now? Yes? Yeah.
I have a question about how you organize your specs. On the car example and the topic example, the topics you have the describe with the method that's in the public interface.
Yeah.
But the car example you didn't. How would you go about organizing, like, how it reads in like RSpec format documentation?
It depends on exactly what I'm testing. It depends is the answer. Typically what I do is I would probably, again, a lot of this I did just to make my slides tighter, but I would actually have a describe with my popular question mark.
Okay.
And then inside of that, I would have multiple contexts, cars red, cars blue, etc. And I left off a lot of that boilerplate for the sake of the slides. I would actually probably have something that looks a little bit more like this, where I have a describe on the method, and then I have several contexts inside of it. I was able to do it here because A, I was copying pretty much from the topics app, and B, I had less code on here, so it was a little easier to fit in there. Any other questions about, oh, am I out of time, Jim?
You are, but go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah,
There's one thing I do that totally violates your principles, and I feel kind of bad doing it, but I don't know what else to do.
That's
So
give it to me.
when I want an object to cache a result, like maybe in the fuel case, if I wanted to cache the fuel variable.
Cache it where?
Cache it in the object, so it doesn't ask for it a second time for some kind of slow API. I have to test that it is making that call once, which is an outgoing query call, which you said not to look for, and then I have to make sure it doesn't do it again. So
Well, again, this is, you're mixing command and query. And so anytime you mix command and query, there's a good chance you may have to break a rule. Because what you're doing is a query that also, you're doing a query that also is a command, because you're commanding it to cache that answer.
But when it queries the API, which is the slow thing I want to cache,
Yeah.
that's just a pure query. Yet I have to test that it only asks that it only does that query once. Plus it's an outgoing query, which you said not to do.
Yes, Jason.
So I would answer that those rules are rules of thumb, and I wouldn't feel bad about doing that.
Yeah, I mean,
So in that
again,
case, that's how you would do it.
Yeah,
You say,
yeah.
test it
I think
once.
you got an interesting edge case there.
yeah, I mean, for the, again, I'll go back to
I
here.
do feel dumb doing it.
I called them some guidelines. And this is more of a rule set. You're right. But, and these are red guidelines, but yes, there are going to be cases, and again, it's edge cases where you're typically blending command and query. And that's exactly what you're doing. And anytime you blend command and query, it's not always necessarily bad. Again, active record and Rails does it all the time, and a lot of times you benefit from it because you can make more concise, cleaner code. But there's a trade-off. Sometimes you end up having to test things that you don't want to test.